Ethan never quite understood why Julian's house felt different from anyone else's. Each time he walked up the narrow stone path leading to the front door, there was a hush about the place, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The curtains rarely shifted, the lights inside were often dim, and the faint scent of cedar clung to the entryway. And yet, whenever Ethan knocked, Julian always answered. Alone.it had become a quiet ritual. Ethan, restless from the monotony of his own apartment, would send Julian a message asking if he was home. The answer was always yes. He never once heard voices in the background, never saw a second pair of shoes by the door. Just Julian, standing there with his soft smile and his careful way of tilting his head, like someone caught in a thought he didn't want to share. Julian wasn't a recluse. He wasn't unfriendly. If anything, he welcomed Ethan in with warmth that seemed almost too measured. They would sit together in the living room, a space decorated with understated taste, dark leather couch, a single lamp in the corner, books stacked neatly by the window. The silence of the house contrasted with Julian's easy laugh and quick wit, and Ethan found himself noticing how much effort Julian made to fill that silence when they were together. Over time, Ethan began to look forward to those visits more than he wanted to admit. Julian's companionship was different from his other friendships. There was no large circle of people, no noisy gatherings, no overlapping obligations. It was just the two of them in that quiet house that seemed suspended from the rest of the world. And in that solitude, Ethan found his eyes wandering, lingering on the shape of Julian's shoulders as he leaned forward in conversation, or the way his smile faltered when he thought Ethan wasn't looking to, wasn't that Ethan was searching for anything beyond friendship. At least, that's what he told himself at first. But something about Julian's solitude tugged at him. It was strange, almost haunting, that someone as engaging as Julian lived in such consistent silence. The absence of others became louder than words, and Ethan couldn't help but ask himself, why is he always alone? One evening, rain traced patterns on the window as they sat with mugs of tea. The steady rhythm outside made the room feel even more secluded, like they had stepped out of time. Julian was recounting a story about his college years, his hands animated in a way Ethan rarely saw. His laughter filled the room, but when it faded, a shadow crossed his expression. Ethan caught it, a flicker of something buried, quickly smoothed over with another smile. "You never talk much about your family," Ethan said carefully. Julian shrugged, sipping his tea. "Not much to tell." His eyes shifted away, settling on the rain. That was the first wall Ethan encountered. The answer was short, polite, and definitive. He knew not to press, but the response only sharpened his curiosity. There was a sense of omission in Julian's words, a quiet refusal to let the conversation wander into certain territory. Still, their friendship grew. They exchanged stories about work, childhood memories, favorite books, and half-formed dreams. Each visit revealed another layer of Julian. His sharp intelligence, his unexpected humor, his moments of vulnerability that surfaced like cracks in glass before sealing again. Ethan began to notice that Julian seemed lighter when he was around, as though company was rare and precious. One Saturday afternoon, sunlight spilled through the living room window, catching dust in golden threads. Julian had put on an old vinyl record, the low hum of music softening the edges of the day. They talked less that afternoon, comfortable enough to let silence exist between them. Ethan's gaze drifted across the room, and for the first time he noticed a door at the far end of the hallway. Closed, unmarked, out of place in a house where everything else felt deliberately arranged. "Hey," Ethan said, gesturing with his chin. "What's behind that door?" Julian's body tensed almost imperceptibly. He glanced toward it, then back at Ethan, his expression smoothing too quickly. "Just storage," he replied, his tone casual but final. The response struck Ethan as odd. The way Julian dismissed the question carried more weight than the words themselves. Ethan opened his mouth to press further, but Julian changed the subject with practiced ease, drawing attention back to the music. It was a small moment, but it lodged itself in Ethan's thoughts. That night, as he walked home under the fading light, Ethan turned the memory over and over. He had never seen anyone else in Julian's house. He had never heard another voice, never caught the clatter of dishes from a kitchen conversation, never noticed photographs on the walls that revealed a larger household. It was as though Julian lived in deliberate isolation, yet never admitted to it. Ethan told himself not to pry. Whatever secrets Julian kept were his own, and friendship required respect for boundaries. And yet, a part of him couldn't let it go. That door in the hallway, the way Julian's tone had sharpened for just a moment, it was evidence of something withheld. Something Ethan wasn't meant to know. As weeks passed, Ethan continued his visits. The laughter remained, the quiet companionship deepened, but his awareness of Julian's solitude grew sharper with every hour he spent in that house. He noticed the subtle heaviness in Julian's sighs, the way his eyes lingered on nothing when silence stretched too long, the practiced way he avoided certain topics. What unsettled Ethan most wasn't just the mystery of Julian's life, but the way he himself was changing. Each time he left, he carried a restless energy, a tugging curiosity, and a warmth that lingered longer than it should. He found himself thinking about Julian in quiet moments, replaying conversations, wondering what truths lay behind that closed door and behind those guarded eyes. One evening, as Ethan stood to leave, Julian's hand brushed his arm. A fleeting touch, light as air, but enough to still him. Julian didn't say anything, didn't even meet his gaze, but the moment stretched, charged with something unspoken. Ethan walked home that night with his chest tight, unable to shake the feeling that their friendship had shifted, imperceptibly but undeniably. And so the pattern continued. Visits, laughter, silences, and a house that echoed with absence. Each time Ethan returned, the air felt thicker with questions. Each time he left, he carried more than just companionship. He carried a secret tension that neither of them had dared to name. Yet the image that lingered most vividly in Ethan's mind was that locked door at the end of the hallway, standing silent and unresolved, a quiet reminder that Julian's solitude was not as simple as it seemed. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, that unanswered question would draw him deeper into a story far more complicated than friendship. The rhythm of Ethan's life began to bend around his visits to Julian's house. Work, errands, and casual gatherings with other friends all felt secondary, mere obligations to pass before the next quiet afternoon or evening with Julian. It wasn't only about curiosity anymore. There was a comfort, a pull he couldn't explain, a sense that something unspoken was building between them with each shared silence. Julian seemed to notice it too. He never said it outright, but the way his voice softened when he greeted Ethan at the door, the way he allowed pauses in conversation to stretch without discomfort, these small signals created a space that felt both fragile and inevitable. One evening, as twilight pressed against the windows, they sat side by side on the couch, a film playing in the background. Ethan wasn't watching. His focus wandered to the space between them, the narrow gap that felt impossibly charged. When Julian shifted slightly closer, the warmth of his body radiated across that distance, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "You come here a lot," Julian said quietly, his eyes still on the screen. "Do you mind?" Ethan asked. Julian hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I like it. It's different with you." The words lingered in the room like a confession. Ethan wanted to ask what he meant, but the weight in Julian's tone told him enough. They both knew this connection was growing beyond friendship, though neither dared to name it. Over the next weeks, Ethan's visits deepened into routine. Sometimes they cooked simple meals together, laughing over burnt pasta or spilled sauce. Other nights, they sprawled across the couch with music playing, talking about books and old memories. Julian was opening up in increments, revealing fragments of a life that had been carefully walled off. But then came the first mention of Daniel. It was late, the rain tapping softly against the windows, when Julian let the name slip. His voice carried no joy, only fatigue. Ethan listened quietly as Julian spoke, a partner who was rarely present, whose career consumed him, who offered provision but little presence. "He's gone most of the time," Julian admitted, staring into his glass of wine. "When he is here, it feels like he's somewhere else entirely." I tell myself it's just the way things are, but sometimes I wonder how long I can keep pretending I'm fine. Ethan's heart tightened. The revelation cast a new light on everything. The solitude, the careful deflections, the guarded smile. Julian wasn't simply alone by choice. He was abandoned in the very place that should have offered companionship. "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly. The words felt inadequate. Julian glanced at him then, eyes glimmering with something raw. "Don't be. Just being able to say it out loud makes it feel less heavy." Ethan wanted to reach across the table, to offer more than words, but he restrained himself. Lines had not yet been crossed, though he could feel the ground shifting beneath them. From that night onward, Daniel's absence became the unspoken backdrop of their meetings. Ethan noticed the subtle ways Julian revealed his loneliness. The lingering look when Ethan laughed at one of his jokes, the relief that flickered across his face when Ethan arrived at the door, the quiet ache in his voice when he spoke of feeling unseen. The bond between them grew heavier with meaning. Ethan found himself thinking about Julian during long commutes, replaying their conversations, wondering what it would be like if the distance between them collapsed entirely. He fought the thought, telling himself he had no right to imagine it. But desire, once ignited, does not obey reason. The night it happened was marked by a storm. The wind rattled the windows, and the house seemed even more cut off from the world. Ethan arrived, soaked through, and Julian laughed, handing him a towel. They ended up in the living room, wrapped in blankets, the storm raging outside while they sat in a cocoon of warmth and lamplight. Julian spoke more freely than ever, his words tumbling out with a mix of weariness and desperation. He confessed the depth of his isolation, how unseen he felt in his own home, how long it had been since he experienced genuine closeness. Ethan listened, torn between compassion and the dangerous pull of temptation. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this," Julian said at last, his voice breaking slightly. "Because you need to," Ethan replied. His hand rested on Julian's, tentative, offering comfort, but trembling with awareness of its implication. Julian didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers turned, meeting Ethan's touch. Their eyes locked, and the storm outside roared like a mirror of the storm within. The first kiss was hesitant, fragile, as though both feared the consequences yet couldn't resist the inevitability. But once it began, restraint faltered. The world narrowed to breath, to touch, to the shocking realization that what they had been circling for weeks was now real. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. "This is wrong," Ethan whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Julian's eyes were dark, conflicted. "I know, but it doesn't feel wrong when I'm with you." The night blurred after that. Words became unnecessary. Their closeness spilled into something physical, something forbidden yet overwhelmingly tender. Every moment carried both guilt and exhilaration, each touch a reminder of what they risked and what they couldn't deny. Afterward, silence filled the room, thick with the gravity of what they had done. Julian leaned against Ethan, his breathing unsteady, his expression a tangle of relief and fear. "I haven't felt like this in years," Julian admitted. Ethan wanted to answer, but words failed him. He was consumed by conflicting emotions, the thrill of newfound intimacy, the weight of betrayal, the knowledge that they had stepped into a territory from which there was no easy return. They sat together in the fading storm, both knowing that a line had been crossed. And yet, despite the guilt threading through Ethan's thoughts, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had never felt so alive, so necessary, so entwined with another person. But the fragile peace of the moment shattered when headlights swept across the front windows. Tires crunched against gravel. A car door slammed. Julian's face went pale. Ethan's heart lurched. "Daniel," Julian whispered. In an instant, the air thickened with dread. The intimacy of the storm-lit night dissolved into cold panic as the sound of keys rattled at the front door. The jingle of keys at the front door froze Ethan where he sat. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat reminding him that he should not be here, not like this, not with Julian still pressed close beside him. Julian sprang to his feet, panic flickering across his face. "Go," Julian whispered, his voice sharp with urgency. Ethan scrambled, his hands clumsy as he gathered himself. The hallway seemed impossibly long as Julian gestured toward the back of the house. The sound of the lock turning filled the air like a countdown. Ethan slipped into the shadows of the corridor just as the front door opened. "Julian," a voice called out. Deep, steady, unmistakably belonging to someone who considered this house his own. "Daniel." Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. Through the narrow crack in the hallway, he glimpsed Daniel, tall, well-dressed, carrying the presence of someone accustomed to control. His coat was damp from the rain, his expression unreadable as he shut the door behind him. "You're back early," Julian said, his tone carefully neutral. Daniel dropped his keys into a bowl on the console. "Meetings were canceled. Figured I'd surprise you." His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the half-drunk glasses of wine on the table, the rumpled blankets, the faint scent of something more intimate than conversation that Ethan's stomach knotted. He prayed the shadows concealed him. Julian moved quickly, gathering the glasses, speaking too casually. "I had a friend over earlier. You know Ethan. He left before the storm got bad." Daniel's gaze narrowed slightly, suspicion glinting in his eyes. "That's so." Julian nodded, his composure tight. "Yeah, he's probably home by now." For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the ticking of a clock. Daniel shrugged out of his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. "I've been gone too much, haven't I?" he asked suddenly, his tone flat but laced with something sharper beneath. Julian faltered, his hands tightening around the wine glasses. "You work a lot. I understand." Daniel studied him. Understanding and being happy aren't the same thing. Ethan felt the words like an intrusion, a glimpse into a fracture that had been widening long before he stepped into it. The tension between them was palpable, born not just from this night, but from months, maybe years, of disconnection. Julian forced a smile. "Let's not do this right now. You've had a long day." But Daniel didn't relent. "No, let's. Because every time I come home, it feels like I'm walking into a stranger's house. You're here, but you're not with me. I can feel it." Ethan's chest tightened. He should have left the moment he had the chance. Yet he stood frozen, an unwilling witness to a conversation that stripped bare the truth Julian had only hinted at. Julian placed the glasses on the counter with deliberate care. "Maybe you feel that way because you're never really here," he said softly. The words cut the air like glass. Daniel stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he didn't reply. Instead, he walked past Julian, heading down the hall. Ethan panicked as footsteps approached. He darted silently into the darkened room nearest him, the same room with the closed door he had noticed weeks ago. Inside, the air was heavy, still. Moonlight from a sliver of window revealed only vague shapes. Stacked boxes, an unused chair, the faint outline of a covered piece of furniture. Ethan crouched low, every nerve on fire, straining to hear that Daniel's footsteps paused outside. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought the door would swing open. Instead, the footsteps retreated, returning to the living room where muffled voices resumed. Relief washed over him, though it did nothing to steady the guilt churning in his stomach. Minutes passed, each one dragging. Finally, Daniel announced he was going to shower. The sound of water running through the pipes gave Ethan his chance. Julian appeared at the door, eyes wide with both fear and apology. "Come on," he whispered urgently. Ethan slipped out, and together they moved silently toward the back door. The night air was damp and sharp when Ethan finally stepped outside, his chest heaving with the weight of what had nearly been discovered. Julian followed, his hands trembling as he shut the door softly behind them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm had calmed, but the silence between them felt louder than thunder. "You can't keep doing this," Ethan said at last, his voice low, rough with conflicted emotion. "If he finds out, I know," Julian interrupted. His eyes glistened under the faint porch light. "I know, but when I'm with you, it feels like I can breathe. Do you understand that?" Ethan searched his face, torn between the pull of desire and the weight of conscience. He wanted to say no, to tell Julian this was dangerous, selfish, wrong. But honesty betrayed him. "I do," he whispered. "That's the problem. Julian stepped closer, his hand brushing against Ethan's, the contact sparking the same forbidden fire that had ignited between them before. "I can't go back to how it was," Julian confessed. "I can't pretend I'm not drowning when I finally know what it feels like to be seen." The raw vulnerability in his voice carved deep into Ethan. He knew this wasn't just infidelity. It was survival, a desperate grasp for connection in a life that had grown hollow. And yet, every step deeper bound them to a secret that could destroy them both. They parted that night reluctantly, Ethan vanishing into the rain-dark street, while Julian returned inside to the life he claimed no longer felt like his. The days that followed only thickened the secrecy. Quick messages, hushed calls, carefully chosen moments when Daniel was away. They wove a fragile web of stolen intimacy. Each meeting was a mixture of tenderness and tension, joy shadowed by the looming threat of discovery. And always, Ethan felt the weight of the choice pressing closer. He could end it, step away before it collapsed under its own deception. Or he could stay, surrender to what was blooming between them despite its cost. One evening, as twilight spread across the sky, Ethan found himself standing once again at Julian's door. Inside, Julian waited by the window, his expression unreadable, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. "This can't last forever," Julian said when Ethan stepped inside. His voice carried no accusation, only weary truth. "I have to decide, between him and you." The words hung between them, heavy, final, trembling with consequences neither could yet face. Ethan's chest tightened, every instinct screaming that he should leave, yet his heart refused to move. Julian turned toward him, eyes searching, the silence louder than any confession. In that moment, Ethan knew their story was no longer simply about secrecy. It was about the impossible choice between safety and desire, between loyalty and truth. And as the room darkened around them, the answer remained unspoken, suspended like a breath they both feared to release.